That was great. Richard and I are on very much a converging path. We have some differences, but at this point, what we care about and what we support and what we are urging is far more important than the differences. So let me say a couple things just at the outset by way of framing in a way that takes off, but is slightly different from the framing argument that Richard presented. And this I want to focus on the United States and the nature of the emerging crisis that we are facing and why it offers opportunity for the kinds of strategies that both he and I endorse and affirm. So, and I think it's critical that we talk about it in these terms. The traditional Marxist crisis collapse presumed a revolution after a crisis collapse. The traditional liberal reform strategy was there would not be a crisis, but labor would enforce a social democratic solution in capitalism. We call it liberalism, in which you can tax, reform, manage the economy, and achieve a high growth rate in the manner of John Kenneth Galbraith, if you like. But not a crisis. That was the reform strategy rather than a revolutionary strategy. We are talking about a strategic possibility that opens up the way to slow and steady evolution, which may or may not achieve a different, more explosive change later, but that the context in which we're working permits and encourages strategies of the kind he described and the kind I'm going to describe shortly. And briefly, if a system does not collapse, and why the United States is probably not likely to achieve the big collapse that was always forecast, the US economy now has government at the rate of 32 to 35% of the economy, depending upon the denominator of the fraction, recession or boom. In 1929, it was 11%. There is a significant floor under the system, and even in times of great difficulty, the corporate leadership and the Bush administration, which was pushing economic stimulus, and the Ronald Reagan's chief advisors were asking for more stimulus because they didn't want the system to totally collapse. And probably they can prevent that collapse. George Bush's famous line is, I'm not going to let this sucker go down. That was his phrasing because he knew the consequences, and more important, the floor was higher. On the other hand, the traditional labor strategy totally depended both in Europe and in the United States on a strong labor union base. The American labor unions have gone from 35.4% of the labor force as members down now to less than 11% and less than 6% in the private sector and declining. The entire institutional muscle of that system of reform that dominated the mid-third of the 20th century is in decay. So the system, and if I had time, I'd give you a longer discussion of this, consider the possibility that the system neither collapses in the traditional way, nor reforms in the traditional way. It's in that context that we are seeing people realize slowly and steadily that something quite fundamental is wrong and does not get corrected. And we're also seeing, and this is the significant point, out of the pain that that produces at the local level, almost entirely ignored by the press, which is 1, not interested, 2, financially stressed, 3, run by corporate interests, and 4, never interested in the localities. At the local level, there's an explosion of developments, all of which are characterized in one form or another, and I'll give you some more examples, by the democratization of the ownership of wealth in one form or another. So I'll give you some discussion of that. And then there are very interesting experiments developing and exploding around the country that push the envelope further on things like worker self-control, worker management, worker ownership, planning, et cetera, bank changeovers, credit union changeovers, changing who owns capital, changing who owns land, democratizing, et cetera. So if you stand back from this, where you see an emerging crisis of ideology, it isn't the case that people are frightened. Here's where Richard and I differ on this very small point. People aren't frightened of the word socialism anymore. The latest polls show that people under 30 who will create the next politics, who else? slightly favor the term socialism over the term capitalism. And the last 3 polls have been a wash, and they've been moving slowly towards favoring the term socialism. The press doesn't report much of that, but that was the latest Rasmussen poll on this. So there is openness even to the language of socialism, and certainly to the concepts and the practicalities that we are beginning to see on the ground. Let me tell you, just to give you a sense of some of the other things. It is not solely what's happening within the firm, though I agree entirely with worker control and worker ownership, and some additions to that, which I'll come to shortly. Around the country, 130 million Americans, another term for what Richard's talking about is a cooperative, which there are 130 million Americans today who are members of cooperatives. A lot of those in credit unions, which is a one-person, one-vote bank, and the credit unions taken together have as much capital as any one of the big 5 New York banks. And there is activism attempting to take over and use credit unions for different purposes. Those are democratic banks, potentially of great power. Nobody goes to the board meetings. They're quite stagnant in most parts of the country. You can go to the board meeting, sign up as a member, and indeed in several parts of the country, people are electing new people, new blood for that institution, trying to turn it around and use it in a different way. From Jackson, Mississippi, there are interesting examples of using the funding to provide money for new kinds of cooperatives of this kind, et cetera, et cetera. You don't hear that in the press. You have to dig and find it. But there are 130 million people who are in one way or another involved. There are some 10 million people involved in different forms of worker ownership, mainly out of the ESOP process, some of those becoming democratized, many of them becoming unionized, and some of them pointing in the direction. There are 3 million more people involved in worker-owned companies already than are members of unions in the private sector. There is an internal discussion and development for more and more participation and control in that structure. Socialization of land is increasing. And again, you don't find it in the press. What this is often called is the land trust. What is a land trust? You draw a circle around land in a large geographic area. You either socialize it, the city owns it, or you socialize it by establishing a nonprofit neighborhood-controlled corporation. The neighborhood owns and controls it. It's a way to prevent gentrification, turn the profits of development towards community services, like offsetting costs of housing for low-income communities. It is a very radical way to take over land, and it is growing around the country. 30 years ago, there were 2, one in southwest Georgia, one in Vermont. There are now hundreds. Irvine, California has 5,000 units of housing in that form of land transformation. There is a fight to take over utilities. There's 16 utilities have been taken over by municipalities already in the last 20 years. There is a whole development going on in trying to take over the internet part of the utilities. 350 communities are doing socialized internet. This is what's going on that probably is not reported, all of which characterized by who gets to own the land, the internet, the worker-owned companies, by democratizing capital in various different ways. There is 20 states are now trying to replicate the Bank of North Dakota, which is a socialist bank, been there for 90 years, nobody noticed it. All of a sudden, people have begun to notice it. Washington is the most farthest along. Oregon is probably going to be next. There are several cities looking to use city deposits. There's an entire public banking movement going on to use city deposits to create the basis of a city-owned bank. In other words, socializing the bank structure. Several cities are doing that. Something is brewing in many, many quarters, all of which is characterized not only in terms of worker management and self-management and ownership, but the larger question, too, of democratic ownership of different pieces of the economic system. Let me give you a couple others that are in development. The healthcare system, almost 20%, almost a fifth of the economy, is in dire straits in terms of cost problems, in terms of structure, in terms of inclusiveness. It is almost certain to create more and more problems as corporations try to throw people out of it through what's called skinny insurance, cutting it way down, or taking the penalties that they pay and then getting people off the rolls. In specific states, the rubber hits the road in the states. 20 states have introduced legislation for single payer. Vermont will achieve it next year. California did twice, passed single payer, not because they only want it, but because the pressures are growing and are likely to continue to grow. What is single payer? It's a public insurance company. That's what Medicare is, a socialized insurance company. You can see state by state by state, that process is almost certain to take over and transform the ownership structures in many, many states in this emergent context of neither collapse nor reform. So there's another piece of the puzzle that's developing, which points towards a fifth of the economy. Those of you who watch the banking sector, and I'm trying to give a whole picture of what is emerging that we haven't paid close attention to. If you watch the banking sector, experts left, right, and center now agree there will be more banking crises. They are back to doing what they've been doing all along. They are bigger now than they were before. And when the next crisis comes, or the one after that, almost certainly the liberal response will be, break them up. That's the current nostrum. And I suspect at some point they'll do that. And then they will regroup, as the big fish will eat the little fish, and they'll be back at the trough again. At some point down that line, I suspect a real nationalization process will be possible. We almost did it in terms of de facto nationalization and gave it back. We had enough capital in many of those banks, public banks, that could have been taken over and nationalized, and de facto they were. AIG, people sometimes think nationalization, piece by piece, is not possible. You may have noticed we did, in fact, nationalize General Motors, AIG, and to a certain degree, Chrysler. As the crisis builds up and this kind of thing happens in future, my judgment is at some point, instead of giving them back, we may keep them and start making mass transit or high-speed rail and turning them into worker public corporations of a large kind. If I had time, I'd sketch out why I think we're beginning to see an evolutionary development which begins to offer many different ways to the simple notion of who gets the capital begins to be a public debate question at many, many levels. Let me turn back to the worker ownership question itself. I see these various developments as compatible with, supportive of, and potentially integratable with the developments that Richard's talking about. But I think they are critical to build a mass movement that has other elements than simply what goes on in the firm. And there are also some problems that need to be dealt with regard to the model, that well-known problems that Richard, I'm sure, has thought as much about it as I have. I first came across this working with steelworkers in 1977, a long time ago. That was in Youngstown, Ohio, the first major collapse of a giant steel industry. Youngstown Sheet and Tube collapsed. 5,000 people lost their jobs in one day. That was news, front page news, television front page news, all over the country, all over the world in 1977. It hadn't happened. Now it's so common that nobody pays attention anymore. But in that particular situation, the steelworkers took the lead and said, why don't we take over this company? Why don't we run it ourselves? But also, it is of such significance to the larger community, this came from the steelworkers, that it ought to be structured in a way that includes the community as a whole as well. So the proposal they made, and which became the part and parcel of what they were trying to do, was for a community worker balance of some kind that would own and control the mill. Now, what happens in that situation is interesting, because one of the problems that if you can do that, and I'll give you a short view of what happened after that. But notice, if you are a worker-owned company, and you find that you are in competition with another worker-owned company in the steel industry, and another one down the road, and you may not want to pollute your neighborhood. But if they do it over there and can cut costs radically, and you haven't found a way to organize across sectors, which is very hard to do, they will wipe you out. Any worker-owned company in the market facing other worker-owned companies who begin to violate the standards and can cut costs will destroy you. And you are forced to do what they do, or the situation gets worse. Community-wide structures internalize externalities. They present larger problems at the national level, but they begin to address that structural issue. My own view is we're going to see a mix of worker-owned companies and worker community-owned companies at different levels, depending upon scale and depending upon circumstances. And another problem we have to face is that the worker-owned companies we've seen in this country so far, the famous plywood companies in the Northwest, didn't produce socialist ideology. They produced conservative Republicans. The internal structures produced people who wanted to get more for themselves. So building a whole larger culture of what this is all about is critical to the development of the vision that he and I share and that I'm sure most people in this audience share. There's another problem that we've begun to see developing, and there are some very interesting solutions beginning to emerge. You mentioned earlier the Cleveland experiments that we're working on in Cleveland, Ohio. The Democracy Collaborative has been heavily involved in Cleveland. So let me give you a structure of what's on the ground now and then talk about some of the things that we think it teaches and need development further. And again, and here's the point, can now be done in the prehistory in which we live of potentially the next American Revolution. Think the prehistory of the New Deal, where labor law was developed state by state by state, and then when the moment had arrived and when enough power had been accumulated and enough ideas had been organized, a developmental thrust can go forward in a different way. Think the prehistory of the American feminist drive in the 19th century, state by agonizing state by agonizing state by agonizing state, laying groundwork and then transforming. And the transformation may be of a different and more explosive kind, but laying down the experience and building now forward so that the new elements are actually representative and more democratized when we get there. I totally agree with Richard on that point. Here's the model in Cleveland, and note the outlines of it and what it might suggest about where we might go around the country. And many, many other cities are doing something very similar to this because there is no answer at the local level. The crisis at the local level forces people to say we either do nothing or something new. We've tried to get benefits for small business. It doesn't work. We try to get the corporations in. What happens is we bribe them for $100,000 a job or $200,000 a job. That's the going price in terms of tax bribes. You want a corporation to come in, it's $100,000 to $200,000 per job that you have to pay, and then they leave in 6 to 7 years. That doesn't work. So what you get is a deepening crisis in many of these cities. Cleveland being one, Detroit being another, St. Louis being a number, you name it. In Cleveland, for complex reasons, which we can go into if you like, but in any case, there is an emergent model which has the following characteristics. Worker-owned and self-directed companies, that's what Richard's talking about. And they are linked together in the Mondragon style, but now geographically oriented to the community as a whole. So they're linked together with a nonprofit corporation. They cannot be sold off and run away. They cannot be sold off to become independent players. And secondly, by definition, they have to kick back to the community building side of that effort, some part of their profits. And another part goes into a revolving fund, very Mondragon-based, in fact, directly Mondragon-based, the notion of which is to help spin off build new, more and more worker-owned companies. That's the structure. Geographic community as the steelworkers had it, and now in this community, using a mixed joint venture of community building and worker-owned cooperatives. That's the larger structure which aims at expanding and developing and building out. Now this is in a part of Cleveland, 40,000 neighborhood. Unemployment, mostly black. Unemployment, 40%. Average family income, 18,000. So that's one feature that takes it beyond standard worker ownership in the marketplace. A second feature is that in the middle of that particular neighborhood, this is true all over the country, by the way. Many cities have these characteristics, and they're picking up on what it means, are big institutions, hospitals, universities, particularly, and other public institutions. Cleveland Clinic is there, one of the largest world clinics in the world. Case Western Reserve University is there. University Hospital is there. Those three institutions alone, and this is true in many parts of the country, purchase $3 billion, with a B, dollars in goods and services a year, mostly financed with taxpayer money, Medicare, Medicaid, educational money, none of which went to this neighborhood. Zero. Now that $3 billion, in addition, there were jobs and salaries. That's leaving that out. And in addition, construction, leaving that out. Just what they buy. So the notion that developed was, why not begin to target some of that purchasing power from institutions that have a public base and are a quasi-public market. I'm sketching for you a decentralized planning system, those of you who watch closely, a quasi-public market to stabilize the market of these worker-owned companies in this complex Mondragon-based but geographically community-oriented structure. And indeed, that's what's happening. That's the model that's beginning to emerge to begin to give stability both to the community and to the worker-owned companies, the worker-owned cooperatives in that area. And these are not small cooperatives. This is what can be done in any city. About 4 months ago, opened up the largest urban agricultural program in the United States, our largest urban greenhouse, 3 million heads of lettuce a year. To do that, I just learned you've got to plant 26,000 heads of lettuce every single day. It's a very powerful, large organization. There is, at this stage, an industrial scale laundry, which uses about a third of the water and a third of the heat, very ecologically green in that area. And then there is a solar installation company that is online to put in as much solar installation as exists currently in the state of Ohio, linked into this complex, and they're hoping to do 1 to 2 to 3 new ones each year. These are all developmental experiments. There are 10 other cities now en route to do something like this out of either a mayor who sees it, or pressure from the bottom, or innovation from another side, beginning to see that there is, and here's the point, in the emerging historical context, there is no other way forward. Either you do something new, or the pain increases. And if you do it, all of a sudden the mayor has a powerful new base for job creation when he talks to the corporations who want the next bribe. He's got something building that he can do also, and he begins to use public resources to help you because it helps him. So I could go on in sketching that, but it is an emergent development that takes the notions we're talking about in a slightly different way, worker self-managed, but also related to a community-wide structure that builds community at the same time, and begins to suggest some of the dimensions of what a decentralized planning system might involve, which also uses the market as a corrective. These are preliminary developments. That we can see them now and that they are viable in the United States is a critical understanding. And here's, Richard and I talked to each other about it, the time is now. This is the phrase. The time is now to begin to develop actual on-the-ground realities, actual conversations with Americans in language they can understand. They are open to understanding something new. They are open to developing new ways forward. We even find, and it's important to understand in these communities, so-called conservatives who they're not the national ideologues. They don't know what it is, but they see these things and say, that's a great idea. The workers are working, they own it, that's a good idea. It helps the community, may even help the local market. The ideological patterns at the local level, go away from what you see on national television, are not set in stone. They are open to answers that are practical, democratic, productive, and meaningful. Where all this could go, and my time must be getting 2 more minutes, where might all this go? There are 3 parts of this I want to mention. First, we are developing prototypes around the country and interest in the directions we're talking about, which, if advanced, begin to suggest, and here we totally agree, a different vision of socialism that is radically decentralized, but also builds up, I would contend, new structures that will help at the planning level. But right now, the main point is unless you do it from the ground up, you don't end up with a democratic solution, both within the workplace and in the communities. That is where we're building and developing. And seeing ourselves, here's where it gets existential, not systemic. Whether, and I am talking to the person in your seat, whether we actually can rise to the scale and say, we actually are in the pre-revolutionary prehistory, which means that we actually begin to act and build and work and do the sort of things that Richard and I both are talking about, and get on with it and talk to Americans as if they can actually hear. So that's a question to face Personally, a lot of the left hasn't done that. It is time to drop that idea that they don't understand. Actually, given the pain levels, they understand a whole lot. What they're looking for, in my experience, is real answers rather than a lot of rhetoric. Nonetheless, what answers we give need to forecast and build towards a different, larger vision. There are two other parts of this. One, getting them on the ground also provides a political base. Labor as an institution has collapsed. These kinds of institutions, we agree, could become and are likely to become the new institutional base over time for the next left politics, if we are serious about them. And then there's a third place, and here I want to go to Gramsci, and here I want to go to people who have talked about the sociology of knowledge. There's been a whole literature of this in the Frankfurt School. What we are also about, and needs to be self-aware and self-conscious, the creation of a new way of understanding to crack the hegemonic ideology. That's part and parcel what this is all about. Showing breakthrough ways that you don't have to buy the old idea system, that there are idea systems that permit us to understand what's going on the ground, but offer ways forward in the realm of ideas, theory, and strategy that crack the old nonsense. So self-consciously building the institutions in order to have a democratic system rather than a statist system is critical. We are totally in accord. Beginning to understand more complexity, I would urge, is very important. Beginning to use and build these institutions as part of the next power base is a second element, but also seeing it self-consciously and with full awareness as a way to crack the ideology and begin substituting a truly democratic vision of the next transformation. Thank you very much.